in order for a kometz to be kosher, it must be fully intact. Isaron miuto ma'akev esrubo. We'll say similarly again, isaron is the minimum measure for a carbon mincha. If you are missing an isaron, if you are missing any part of an isaron, even if the majority of the isaron is intact, nevertheless the carbon mincha is compromised. Hayayin miuto me'akev esrubo. Similarly by wine. We'll say Pashtus will say this about by nisachim, wine libations. In order for a wine libation ultimately again to be valid, the entire amount must be intact. Hashemen miuto ma'akev esrubo. Similarly again by oil, right? Which also is talking about again also by karbanos. The full measure of the oil must be intact. Hasolas v'hashemen ma'akvin ze'ezeh. In a carbon mincha, the fine flour as well as the oil are ma'akev one another. In other words, you have to have both the flour and the oil in order for the carbon, for the mincha to be valid. Hakometz v'levona ma'akvin ze'ezeh. Similarly, again by the carbon mincha, the kometz, right, and the levona is the frankincense, must both be present in order for the carbon to be kosher. Says the Gemara, my taima, what's the reason for this? Amrikra, melo kumtzo trezini. So we're going to see now all of the items mentioned in the Mishnah. The Gemara understands that in order for them to be kosher, you must have the full amount. So what we're going to see is, the Gemara is going to learn out each of these items. How do you know they need the full amount? So by the kamitza, how do I know that the entire kamitza must be intact? And that if any part of it is missing, ultimately, again, the carbon is compromised. So the Gemara says, Amakra, melo kumtso trezini. The pasuk says you must have the kometz in its entirety. Ultimately, again, twice. Melo kumtso, the complete. I think that there are chairs missing. I think they took chairs from here for the Yomi Milroim setup. All right, so we'll have to. W, you could just take and bring it in. Thank you. So the Gemara says, Melo kumtso tresimni, isaron miuto ma'akev esrubo. So we'll say, how do I know about the isaron, which is the minimum measure of the mincha? How do I know that even if some of it is missing, ultimately again it's ma'akev, the majority of the carbon? So my time, amakra misolta, because the pasuk says from its fine flour, shimchasra kol shu psula, that if any amount ultimately is missing, it will be possible. Hayayin miuto ma'akev esrubo. So by yayin, by wine libations, even a small amount of it ultimately is ma'akiv, ultimately takes away, even if the majority is intact. Kacha, because the pasuk says, the pasuk used the version of kacha. So we'll say kacha ye'aseh. Kacha teaches me that this is how it has to be, i.e., the entire amount must be intact. Hashem and mi'utu ma'akiv esrubo. We'll say when it comes to oil, right? When it comes to oil as part of a carbon. So if you're missing any part of it, it is ma'akiv. So the minchas, so where do we learn this out from? The minchas nisachim. So we'll say when we're talking about the mincha that accompanies nisachim, so the pasuk says kacha, u'minchas nedava, amakra u'mishamna. Shemchisar kol shu psula. Pasuk used the word mishamna to teach you that all of the oil must be intact, and if some of it, or all of the oil must be present, if some of it is missing, the carbon is compromised. Hashemen v'hasolos ma'akvin zeh. So we'll say I need both wine and oil, and if either of them are missing, they compromise the carbon. Misalta u'mishamna, migarsha u'mishamna. Hakometz v'halavona ma'akvin zeh. Similarly, I can give you both the kometz and the levona. Al kol levonosa, because the pasuk says you need all of the levona. Ves kol halevona asher al hamincha. Teach me that both the levona as well as the kometz are ma'akev zeh. Good. So we'll say, so bottom line, what the Gemara learns out from all of these rushes is that halacha lemaisa, these items mentioned are ma'akev. Again, so you see, by the way, different ways that the Torah learns out, the Gemara learns out ikuv. Torah learns out that something is an indispensable part. Either, again, from the fact that the Torah repeats something, or number two, from the fact, ultimately, again, that the Torah uses some type of absolute lashon. So the Gemara goes weiter. Mishnah goes weiter. Shnei Seiri Yom Kippur Makvan Zeh. What's that? Listen to this. Amazing. So we're getting out to Yonei Diyoma. The two Seirim of Yom Kippur are ma'akev each other, which Rabbi means, remember again, the two Seirim referred to over here is that one of the cornerstones of the Yom Kippur Avodah is the drawing of the lots for the two goats. One of them is offered up as a carbon. One of them goes out la'azazel. One of them goes out and is thrown off the cliff. So we'll say you need both of these seirim. If you don't have both, in the absence of one compromises the performance of the other. Which we'll say, by the way, what the Mishnah is telling you over here, we're not going to get so into this now, but what it's telling you is what happens if I only have one seir? Let's say again there's a seir shortage. I only have one seir that year. So it sounds like what the Mishnah is saying is what happens if you only have one seir? What happens if you only have one seir? You don't do it. You don't do it, meaning the avod of Yom Kippur is b'shtei seirim. If you have both, great. If you don't, one is ma'akiv on the other. To which the Gemara says, Shnei kivsei atzeres ma'akiv zeh. Similarly again, the two kvasim, the two sheep of the Shavuos offering are also ma'akiv one another. Beis chalos ma'akvo zu at zu. The two loaves of Yom Kippur, what we call, of not Yom Kippur, of Shavuos, right? What we call the Shtei Halechem, are also ma'akev one another. Shnei Sidarim ma'akvin zeh zeh. Well, this is actually quite interesting. The Shnei Sidarim are the two rows of Lechem Apanim. Remember again, the Lechem Apanim was arranged on the Shulchan essentially in two stacks of 6 loaves each. Those 2 stacks are ma'akev one on the other. So when we say ma'akev, it means you can't have one stack without the other. If you're missing one of the stacks, ultimately, again, you've compromised the lechem apanim. Shnei star ma'akvin zeh. Shnei bazichin ma'akvin zeh. Each stack had its own spoon of levona, of frankincense. So ultimately, again, if you're missing one of the spoons, the one is ma'akiv on the other. Hasdarim v'habazichin ma'akvin zeh. Similarly, again, I will say the sdarim, the rows, as well as the spoons of levona, are also ma'akiv one on the other. Beis minim shebenazir. We'll say the 2 different parts. We'll discuss this in greater depth in the Gemara. But the 2 different types of bread offered up with the Nazir's offering are ma'akiv one on the other. Gimel shebepara, the dalid shebetoda. See again the 3 different parts of the para aduma's tara, which Rashi points out was the eitz erez, the piece of cedar wood, the azov, the hyssop, and the shnitolas, the piece of red wool. Those 3 pieces, or those 3 parts, are ma'akev zalza. You need all 3 of them to affect the tara of the para aduma. The dalid shebetoda, and I will say the 4 different parts of the toda offering are also ma'akev one on the other. The dalid shebelulav, the 4 different parts. I will say it's very exciting. I told you, I promised you. I feel like I'm over delivering actually on this. Right? Remember again, we just saw Yom Kippur. Now we're getting to Sukkis, the dalid minim, dalid shebelulav, the 4 parts of lulav, which is the lulav, the esrog, the adasim, and the aravos, are all ma'akev one of you. If you're missing one, the mitzvah is compromised. Va'arba shemetzora, the 4 different parts of the mitzvah, mitzvah's tara process, his carbonic process, are ma'akvin zelzeh, shiva hazos, shebepara, the 7 sprinklings of pardum, which also refers to the 7 different sprinklings on a person who is tamei, are ma'akvos zu zu. If you're missing any one of them, also remember again, when we say something is ma'akev, what that means is if you're missing any part of it, ultimately, again, it is invalid. Zayin hazios sha'al bein habadim sha'al paroches sha'al mizbeach hazav ma'akvo zu. There's 7 sprinklings that are done between the poles of the aron, that are done on the paroches, the curtain of the kodesh hakadoshim, that are done on the golden mizbeach, which I will say this is a combination of different things. This is Yom Kippur. This is the Par Kohen Mashiach, Par Ha'elam Davar Minat Tzibor, a whole bunch of different offerings. But the common denominator is Ma'akvos Zu Es Zu. All of these items ultimately, again, are ma'akev one another. Says the Gemara, we're going to go through this list now. It's actually very exciting. How do we know, Abosai, that the 2 goats of Yom Kippur are ma'akev zeh zeh? Abosai is actually quite an amazing idea. That even though, again, these 2 goats ultimately, again, have different purposes. One is la Hashem, one is la Azazel. Nevertheless, again, the absence of one will compromise your ability to offer the other. Where do I know this from? Because the Gemara says, because the pasuk says chukah. Both say the Torah, when speaking about ultimately, again, this service, calls it a chukah. V'haisazos lachem lechukas olam. The fact that it groups them both as a chukah tells me that what? That halacha lemaisa, They are both necessary, and the absence of one compromises the other. How do I know that the two sheep of Shavuos, the two offerings of Shavuos, are ma'akev zeh havia? Because the pasuk says, "Vosai uses lashon of havia." The exact lashon that the Gemara brings down is v'haisa. V'haisa is also an absolute lashon of it has to be this way. Shtei chalos, same idea. By the two loaves of Shavuos, havia v'haisa it says. Shnei sidarim, the two stacks of lechem apanim bread. How do I know that I need both of them? Chuka. Shnei bazichin, the two spoons of frankincense. Chuka. Hasdarin v'habazichin, I need the two stacks and the two spoons. Chuka. Shnei minin shebenazir, we'll say, how do I know that I need the two different types of bread? By the offering of the nazir, the kenye aseh. This is how it has to be done. Gimel shebepara, the three different ingredients in the purification of the para duma, chuka. Arba'a shebetoda, how do I know that I need the four different types of items when it comes to the carbon toda? The iskish the nazir, because toda is compared to nazir. Dichsiv al zevach todav shlamav. Va'amarmar, shlamav the rabbo shalmi nazir. Good. Va'arba shemitzora, how do I know that I need the four different parts of mitzora? Dichsiv zostiyet torah samitzora. The Dalit Shavu Lulav. Now I will say we're going to spend a little bit on this because it's actually very exciting. 4 different species of lulav. So lulav, esrog, hadassim, aravos. How do I know that I need all 4 of them? Ulikachtem. Because the pasuk says you shall take them. Lekicha tama. Lekachtem is an absolute phrase. You shall take them. It must be a complete taking. Complete taking means what Rabbi say? That Allah I need all 4 items. I need all 4 items together. Lekicha tama. So the Gemara says, Amrav Chana Barava, Lo Shanu Ela She'en Lo. So this is actually quite amazing. So Chanan Barava says as follows. When do we say ultimately again that the dalid meaning of the lulav are ma'akiv, that if you're missing any one of the 4 species, that it compromises the mitzvah? That's when literally one of the species is not present. Aval yeshlo, but if it's present, ein ma'akvin. Ultimately, it's not ma'akiv. They're both saying, what does that mean? What Rav Chanan bar Ava seems to be saying as follows. If you look at Rashi, aval yeshlo ein ma'akvin, afilu lo ogdan ke'echad. This is amazing, I will say. So Rav Chanan bar Ava seems to be saying as follows, that when do we say that if you're missing one of the parts, it's ma'akiv the mitzvah? That's when it's not there. But if it's there, see, here's the interesting part. Rashi says if it's there, but you don't include it in the igud, right? If it's there, but you didn't bundle them all together, then ultimately, again, it will work. So what does this mean? So we'll say, take a look at Rashi, take a look at Tosas. We don't have time to do this justice, but I can't I feel like I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't show you this Tosas. So I'm going to show it to you quickly, and then you're going to do it, you're going to be ma'ayin it and for homework. So look at Tosas just a moment. Tosas says, Lo shanu ela she'ein lo, aval yesh lo ein ma'akvin. Perish ba'alachas gidos. This is going to blow you away. Perish ba'alachas gidolos, bilchos lulav, Yeshlo ein ma'akvin delo tema ad makbalu ba'adi adadi lo nafik ila imagba chad lekudei tak shapir dami the kamalan lulav ein sarach haguda. So also listen to this. The halachas gedolos actually says that the mitzvah by lulav is what? To have all 4 species. And even if you pick them up one at a time, even if you would say the ikr is that what? The ikr is that you have all 4 of them. And that's the way he understands Rav Chanan bar Rava's statement. We'll say this is amazing. That Rav Chanan bar Rava is saying is, ulakachta means what? Ulakachta means what? Well, you have to have them. You have to possess them. They have to be on the table in front of you at the same time. Do you need to lift them up all together at the same time? No. As long as they're there before you at the same time and you lift them up one at a time, that's enough. Comes along Rabbeinu Tam, and Rabbeinu Tam says, my dear friend, Bahag, Bahalachas Gedolos, you're mamish out of your kalim. What's the matter with you? How can you say such a thing? I mean, it's not a direct quote, but you understand. Rabbeinu Tam, he gave a sifro. To Rabbeinu Tam, he actually had a different annotation. Lo shanu perish de ma'aki mishum tama, ela she'ein lo, aval yesh lo tama, afa pish lo chibru ba'aguda. Rabbeinu Tam says, craziness, absolutely not. Of course you have to take all four of the species together. I will say what we're going to see over here, that Rabbeinu Tam is saying, what the Gemara is telling me is, I don't need aguda. See, I will say, we're going to do this inside in just a moment. You know, it's always interesting that when people come, we do a little of an esrog sale here, that there are some people who are more makbid, on making sure they get the right number of rings than what their esrog looks like, right? It's all about the rings. The rings are a very big thing, like the holster and the rings. So we'll say that's for good reason, because that's called aguda. The idea by Dalid Minim is the Dalid Minim have to be bound together. Those holsters and the ring are not there for just convenience sake. They're there because that's how we perform the mitzvah of Daled Minim Lechatchila, as we're going to see, by binding everything together. In fact, again, some have that's why you'll see some, you see it's much on Eretz Yisrael, they bind it together without the holster, without anything else at all. Everything should be bound together directly. That's the mitzvah, or that's the concept of Aguda. Rabbeinu Tam says, no. What the Gemara is teaching me is, of course the four species have to be taken together. They have to be taken together, but they don't have to be bound together. So if I were to pick up my lulav, not as much the esrog, because esrog is different, but my lulav, my hadassim, and my aravas, and I hold them all in one hand, and my esrog in a different hand, I'm yotze, even though what? The lulav, hadassim, and aravos are not bound together. So we'll say an earth-shaking machlokes between the Bahag and Rabbeinu Tam. Bahag understands that the Gemara is literally teaching, Rav Chanan is teaching me, that even if I lift them up one by one, I'm actually yotze. Rabbeinu Tam saying craziness. Everyone agrees you have to pick them up at once. The shaila is, do you need igud or not? Do you need them to be bound? L'chatchila you should, but b'diavad you don't. So watch this, Rabbi. We go on. Beautiful Gemara. Neisvei, dalimin, shabalulav. There are four different species in the lulav. Beis, mehen, os, and peros. So we'll say two of the species produce fruit. So what are the two of the species that produce fruit? The lulav and the esrog. Right, lulav is from a date palm, produces date. Esrog itself is the fruit of a tree which also has the very seeds to reproduce to produce other esrogim. Ubeznen enos aperos, and two of the species, i.e. hadassim and aravos, do not create peros, do not bear any kind of fruit. So watch this. Use zikukim, so the Gemara says, osin peros, ha'osin peros, use kukim l'sheinosin, v'she'in osin peros, we'll say first of the wide lines on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, v'she'in osin peros, use kukim l'osin peros. We'll say, what's the halacha? The halacha is the ones that produce fruit require the ones that don't produce fruit, and the ones that don't produce fruit ultimately, again, need the ones that do produce fruit. So the Gemara says, "Ve'ein adam yotzei yedei chavasa bahen ad shekulan ba'aguda achas." We'll say this is such a beautiful Gemara, and the halacha is the ones that produce fruit are not kosher until they're bundled with the ones that produce fruit, and the ones that produce fruit require the ones that don't produce fruit. V'chein Yisrael, and Abba said the same thing is with Klal Yisrael. So beautiful. B'hartzah ad shekulan ba'aguda achas. Abba said there is no Klal Yisrael. Rashi says B'hartzah kishein misanin ein na'anin. When we fast, even when we fast in Yom Kippur, we are not answered at shekulan ba'aguda achos tzadikim urishaim dunya da'osin ve'ein osin peros. You know, Rabbi said Klal Yisrael has a lot of different kinds of people. There are some people who produce peros, those are the tzaddikim. There are some people who don't produce peros, those are unfortunately the rishoim. And lest you think that one is more important than the other, you need all of them. Just like the lulav and the esrog need the hadassim and the aravos, they produce the ones that produce the fruit, need the ones that don't produce the fruit. Ultimately, again, the ones that don't produce the fruit need the ones that do produce the fruit. Klal Yisrael is only when all of the species come together. It's so beautiful. Shnei Amar, Habon B'Shama Al Yosef, V'Agudaso Al Eretz Yasda. The idea is, that's the last part of the phrase is what's important for us. V'Agudaso Al Eretz Yasda. When is that which is built on the earth solidified? Only when there's an agudo, only when everything is brought together. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara, by the way, the reason the Gemara is bringing this down is not for some beautiful Achdus pep talk, but remember again, this is because it seems to contradict what we just said before. We just said before, Rav Acha said that you don't need all of the species bundled at once. Here it seems to indicate that you do need all of the species bundled at once. To which the Gemara says, Tanohi. In reality, it's a machlokes tanaim disanyo, lulav, bein agud, bein she'eno agud kosher. So it's like Gemara quotes a brisa. The first part in the brisa says, lulav, whether it's bound together or not bound together, it is kosher. Rabbi Yehuda says, agud kasher, she'eno agud pasol. Rabbi Yehuda says, if it's bound together, it's kasher. If it's not bound together, it's pasol. So we'll say this is a very dramatic sheet. Rabbi Yehuda is actually saying, if it's not bound together, it's pasol. So the Gemara says, my time Rabbi Yehuda. Where does Rabbi Yehuda learn this out from? Kamar kicha kicha me'agudas ezov. We'll say, interestingly enough, he learns this out from kicha kicha by ultimately, again, by the Azov, by the sprinkling of the waters of the Para Aduma. Ma'ala halon ba'aguda, just like by Para Aduma, all the different pieces have to be taken together in a bundle. Afkan ba'aguda, so too, by Lulav, everything has to be taken in a bundle. V'Rabbanon, lo garmi kicha kicha, ultimately, again, the Rabbanon they don't have this Gzeira Shava. So, Kiman azlaha desanya, so we'll say, according to who does the following brisa follow? Lulav, mitzvah la'agdo. We'll say there is a mitzvah to bind together the lulav. Ve'im la'agdo kasha, but if you didn't do igud, if you didn't bind them together, now what does this mean if you didn't bind them together? You're still what? You're still taking everything together, you just didn't bind it together. So if you didn't bind it together, it's still kasha. So Kiman, whose opinion does this reflect? Ikra Yehuda lo agda my kasha. We'll say if it's Rabbi Yehuda, so if you didn't bind it together, then why is it kasha at all? Rabbanan my mitzvah. And if it's the Rabbanan, then what mitzvah is there? To which the Gemara says the Olam Rabbanan, umay mitzvah. So we'll say really it's the Rabbanan. And even though the Rabbanan say you don't have to bind them together, what's the mitzvah? My mitzvah mishum zekeli vanvehu. We'll say it's because of hidr mitzvah. Zekeli vanvehu is the mitzvah of hidr mitzvah to beautify the mitzvah. Even the Rabbanan who say that you don't have to bind the species together will agree that what? That you definitely should try to, because it is a more beautiful way of performing the mitzvah. And I will say, this is indeed halacha l'maisa, the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins. The way we paskin is, all four species must be taken together. Do they have to be bound together? Do they need to be bound together? The answer is l'chatchila, no. But because of hidr mitzvah, the Shulchan Aruch writes, mitzvah li'agdo. The best way to perform your mitzvah of Daled Minim is to have all of the species bound together. But if for some reason you didn't do that and you just picked them all up together in one hand, right? Again, you have to pick them up all together. Then bidi evet, not even bidi evet. Then halacha l'maisu, you are yotze. But of course, we strive to do the mitzvah the most beautiful way possible. Incredible. Weiter. Sheva zo sheva para makvo zu. So we're going to remember now para duma, 7 sprinklings of the para duma, which are the 7 sprinklings upon the person who is tamei. Are ma'akvos. You need all 7. Where do we know that from? Chuka. Ultimately, because the Torah uses the word chuka, like we saw before. Sheva zo shal bin abadim, v'shal mizbeach hazav, v'shal parochas, ma'akvos zu ezu. So ultimately, again, the 7 sprinklings are both said that are done between the poles of the aron. That's a reference ultimately to Yom Kippur. V'shal mizbeach hazav, v'shal parochas, or on the golden altar, or on the curtain of the Beis Hamikdash, are also ma'akvos zu ezu. So the Gemara says, where do we know this from? Yomi Kippurim ksiv. So also by Yom Kippur it says chuka depar kohen Mashiach, the special sin offering of the kohen gadol, u depar helam davar shel tzibor. And I will say that's the sin offering when the Sanhedrin makes an erroneous ruling and the majority of Klal Yisrael follows it. U desir vadas kochavim, and ultimately again the special seer that's offered up when the collective, when Klal Yisrael worships Avodah Zarah. Kedisanya va'asa lepar kasher asa lepar. You shall do for the par like you did for the par. So we'll say that's talking about ultimately again for the par helam davar shel tzibor, you have to go ahead and treat it like the par kohen Mashiach. Ma tamud lomar. Ultimately again, what does the pasuk come in to teach me? Lichbal bazos. Why is it that the pasuk is repeating the halachos ultimately again of sprinkling the blood to teach me as follows? So we'll say Amud Beis. Shemchiser achas mikala matanos, to teach me that if I went ahead and I forgot or I neglected to do any one of the sprinklings, lo asaklum. Ultimately, again, my actions are irrelevant. So I'll say what we see over here is by the par of Yom Kippur, by par helam davar shel tzibor, by par kohen Mashiach. Ultimately, again, by all of these significant, what we'll call bull offerings, the halacha is you need all of the sprinklings, and if you end up missing out on any one of them, you have effectively compromised the carbon. Sheva hazo sheva para. Shason, Bein Shelo Lishman, Bein Shelo Mechuvan. So this is actually very interesting. The 7 sprinklings of the blood that are done by the para, right? This is by para usually just means para duma, but we're going to see it applies to all of the special bull offerings. Shason, Bein Shelo Lishman, if any of the sprinklings were done not for the proper intent, or bein shalom mechuvanos. So this is actually very interesting. Shalom mechuvanos means not in exactly the right direction. We're going to discuss this because there are certain sprinklings. When we speak about sprinklings, so generally, again, they're done in a general region. There are certain sprinklings which have to be done in a very specific type of direction. So if it wasn't done with the right intent, or wasn't done with the right direction, psulos, ultimately, again, they are apostle. V'shebifnim, but I will say the sprinklings that are done inside, for example, again, that refers either to inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim or inside the Kodesh, inside the actual Beis HaMikdash itself. So Rashi points out the example of this would be the par of Yom Kippur, the par Kohen Mashiach, the par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor, and the Seirei Avodos Kochavim. So what's the halacha? Shebifnim v'shebe mitzora l'shman shalom l'shman psulos. If they were done shalom l'shman, then they're pasul. Shalom mechuvanos ksheros. But ultimately, again, if they were done not exactly the right direction, then ultimately they will still be kosher. I have a hatanya gabi para shalom l'shman psulos shalom mechuvanos ksheros. But yet we learn by para aduma that if the sprinkling was done shalom l'shman, it's pasul. But if not exactly in the right direction, it's still kosher. Amar Rav Chisda lo kasha. It's not a contradiction. Harav Yehuda Harabanan. Two different opinions. Tisanya bichusare kapara shenichnesu la'azara b'shogeg. This is actually a very interesting sugya. If ultimately, again, michusare kapara refers to people who are still missing part of their kapara process. So what happens? Therefore, because they're missing part of their kapara process, they're not cleared for entry into the Beis HaMikdash. So what happens? But they enter into the Azara. They enter into the Beis HaMikdash. So what's the halacha? B'shogeg chayiv chatos. If they came in, if it was an accidental entry, bless you, they'll be chayiv chatos. B'meizid anish kares. But if they did intentionally chas v'shalom, they're chayiv kares. Ve'in tzarech lamar tvul yom. And it goes without saying that these halachos apply to a tvul yom. We'll say, who's the tvul yom? The tvul yom was a person who went to the mikvah, but still requires herav shemesh ultimately to complete his taru. Shar kol atmeim. Excuse me. Ushar kol atmeim. V'atahorim shenichnesu lifnim mechitzasa lehechal kulo. Supposed to listen to this. And all of the other tmeim who went in literally lifnim mechitzason, who come in past the area where they are permitted to enter. So ba'arboim. Ultimately, again, if we're talking about in the Heichal, so if they come in, I will say, further than they're supposed to, they get malchus. Mi beis la paroches, al pnei kapores. If they come in, Rabbi say, into the actual Beis HaMikdash itself, what we call the Heichal, mi beis la kapores, or up to the curtain of the Beis of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and that includes, of course, the Kodesh HaKadoshim as well, b'misa. Ultimately, again, they are put to death. Rabbi Yehuda says, kol heichal kulo umi beis la parochas ba'arboim. Ultimately, again, the heichal in its entirety, we'll say, just so we're clear on our designations here, that when we speak about the Beis HaMikdash, we generally include the entire temple compound in that discussion. That compound includes the Azara, which is the courtyard, and then there's the Heichal. The Heichal is the actual building of the Beis HaMikdash. Inside that building is where you had the golden Mizbeach, the menorah, the Shulchan. Then you had a curtain. That area is called the Kodesh. Then you had a curtain. That curtain, then behind that curtain was the Aron. That's called the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. So when we speak about Beis HaMikdash, we generally refer to this entire area. The Gemara now is kind of dividing up that area into different parts. Rabbi Yehuda says, Kol Eichal Kulo, Umi Beis La Paroch. The entire Heichal, which means the structure of the Beis HaMikdash, up until the curtain, if you walk in there and you're not allowed to be there, Malchus. Vel Pnei Kapores. But if you enter into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, then what? B'misa. Ultimately, again, you go ahead and you put that. Good morning, Mr. Schoenfeld. Baruch haba. Welcome back. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, so what are they arguing about? So B'haikros, the Gemara says they're arguing about the drasha of the following pasuk. Vayomer Hashem Moshe, daber el Aron achicha va'al yavo b'chol eis al hakodesh mi beis la parochas. So we'll say, amazing. Right, so remember again, this is the kriya for Yom Kippur. This is kriya for Yom Kippur. So Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, tell Aaron your brother, and tell him he cannot come at any time. El hakodesh mi beis la parochas. He may not come at any time. I will say now, we normally assume that this is referring to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. Tell him he can't come at any time to the Kodesh mi beis la parochas. El pnei kapores asher al ha'aron. He cannot come at any point to pnei hakapores. What's Pnei HaKapores? Pnei HaKapores literally means the lid of the Aron. Asher al ha'aron v'lo yomus, order that he not dies. So again, Kadosh Baruch Hu is telling Moshe to tell Aaron, you can't come whenever you want into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So watch this. Rabbanan Savri el HaKodesh b'lo yovo, mi beis la parochas, ve'al pnei HaKaporos b'lo yamos. So we'll say the Rabbanan darshan as follows. Kadosh Baruch Hu is telling us to come to the Beis HaMikdash itself. When you're not allowed to, that's below yovo. That's a lav. To come into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, into the area of the Aron, that's what? Below Yamos. That is a punishment of Misa. Rabbi Yehuda holds no. El HaKodesh umi beis laparoches below Yavo, ve'el pnei HaKapores below Yamos. He holds ultimately again, Rabbi Yehuda says, El HaKodesh umi beis laparoches, that's the lav. Pnei HaKapores ultimately again is below Yomos. My time of the Rabbanon. So what's the reason of the Rabbanon? Because Rabbanon will say as follows: if Rabbi Yehuda is correct, lichtov rachmana el hakodesh v'el pnei hakapores v'lo boy mi beis laparoches. Let the Torah just say el hakodesh and el pnei hakapores, and you don't need to write mi beis laparoches. V'ana aminan, I would say as follows: heichol mechayiv. If you're going to be chayiv misa, ultimately again for what? For coming into the heichol, mibeis la paroches, meaning you're not allowed to. Mibeis la paroches, then I need to say you're going to be chayiv misa if you come inside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Therefore, if that's the case, mibeis la paroches, the kasev rachman alamali. Why do I need that phrase mibeis la paroches? Shmamina b'misa. It must be to teach me that what? That there's a chayiv misa dafka for coming into the Kodesh HaKadoshim and not just coming into the heichol. Rabbi Yehuda, what did Rabbi Yehuda say? Iksiv rachmana el HaKodesh. If the pasuk would have just said to the Kodesh, "V'lo ksimi beis laparoches," and it wouldn't have said beis laparoches, hava mina, I would have thought, my Kodesh. What does Kodesh mean? Mi beis laparoches. Kodesh means what Rabbi say, entering into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Aval heichal lav nami lo. But maybe again for illegal entry into the heichal, maybe there's not even a lav. Rabbi say first of the widest lines, chav zayin amud beis. V'Rabbanon hahu lo matzis amris. The Rabbanon will say, no, you can't even come up with such a suggestion. Why not? The Heichal Kula Ikri Kodesh. Because the Heichal in its entirety ultimately again is called Kodesh. Shene'emar v'hevdila paroches lachem ben HaKodesh u'ben Kodesh HaKadoshim. Rabbi Yehuda, my timer, what's Rabbi Yehuda's logic? If you would think as the Rabbanon hold, Lichtov Rachmana el HaKodesh u'mibeis laparoches v'lo boi el pnei HaKapores. Let the Torah just write El HaKodesh u'mibeis laparoches, and you don't need the phrase for El Pnei HaKapores. Va'ana minan, I would say, mibeis laparoches b'misa, El Pnei HaKapores miboi. If there's going to be a chiyav misa, ultimately again for what? Mibeis laparoches. Outside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, just entering into the Kodesh, then do I even need to write that there is a chiyav misa for entering into the Kodesh HaKadoshim illegally? Al pnei HaKapores t'chasev rachman alamali. So if that's the case, why do I need that phrase, Al pnei HaKapores? Shmamina, Al pnei HaKapores b'misa, mi beis laparoches ba'ashara. Rabbi Yehuda therefore says, it teaches me as follows. The only time that there is a chiyav misa, Bosai, is when you enter into the Kodesh HaKadoshim illegally, but just merely, quote unquote, merely entering into the Kodesh, to the Heichal, to the Beis HaMikdash illegally, will only come with a lav, a prohibition. V'Rabbanan, hachanami delot tzarech. The Rabbanan say, you're right. This phrase is really somewhat extraneous. V'haydich siv rachmana al pnei HaKapores, but the reason why the Torah goes ahead and brings down that phrase al pnei HaKapores, lemeute derech meshupash. Boss is actually quite interesting to teach you that you are not chayiv if you come in to the Kodesh HaKadoshim in a regular fashion. If you take a look at Rashi, it's 5 lines down on the wide lines of Rashi. Lemeute derech meshupash. Rashi says, Kigon meshubash, shechater achoma shalifnai v'lifnim, va'asa pesach b'daram o b'tzafon v'nichnas, v'lo nichnas b'pesach shema mizrach. Sheipanav lamarav. So we'll say, actually, interesting. Rabbi Yehuda understand the Rabbanon. You understand this to mean that the only time you are chayiv for illegal entry into the Kodesh HaKadoshim ultimately is when you come in the normative way, i.e., through the east, through the curtain. But if you tunneled in or you bored a hole through a different wall of the Kodesh HaKadoshim and you walk in like that, you are not chayiv misa for illegal entry. Let's just read this line, then we'll stop. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, al pnei HaKapores kedma. The pasuk says you shall write to the entranceway of the lid of the Aron, or it should say facing the lid of the Aron east. What does that come to teach me? Zeh bana'av. Kol makom shenamar pnei elo eino elo pnei kedem. Kadim. Ultimately, again, from the fact that it says Al Pnei HaKaparos Kedma teaches me that I'm only chayiv ultimately if I enter into the Kodesh HaKadoshim eastward, i.e. facing the kaparos, facing our normative way. But if you bore yourself an entryway through a different wall, you will not be chayiv misa for entering into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So we'll stop over here for today. I'm going to record the rest probably until the Mishnah in Meretz Hashem until tomorrow. But I will say, I just want to tell you, it's the next couple of blocks that we're going to be getting to really through Rosh Hashanah are incredible and magnificent sugyas. We have some beautiful agadata, we have some incredible halacha. So again, especially in these coming days, there's a lot of Yom Tov ahead of us. And Yom Tov is a great time because there's actually time to learn. Baruch Hashem on Yom Tov. So, even if we've had a little bit of a rough go with some of these Gemaras, we'll say this is the time, this is the season for recommitment, and this is the season for recommitment to the daf as well. Meretz Hashem again, tomorrow morning, 5:45, you'll do the homework that we'll post the Meretz Hashem on the WhatsApp in just a little bit, and the Meretz Hashem tomorrow we'll pick up at the Mishnah Chav Chesam and Aleph. Shkoyach.